Thank you. I'm Mark Bloomfield. I'm the 67-year-old president of the American Council for Capital Formation, which is sponsoring this. I've been working on tax reform with the ACCF. I've been with them for 40 years, and we still haven't gotten tax reform. We're going to get it this year. Everybody's interested in economic growth. You probably read the JEC report on it, with the role of tax policy. They were here before the hearings. Those of you who really care about tax reform are here before the hearings. The rest of them, the lazy ones, are still sleeping and just coming to the hearing. Before I go any further, I do want to recognize Dr. Pinar Chebbi, our chief economist. She's the one who's made it possible. I'm just up here welcoming you. Having said that, we're delighted with our panel, a most distinguished panel. Let me just start on the person on my left, Alan Auerbach. If you don't know him, he was at the JEC and knows more about tax policy than anybody else at NBER. Then we have Janice Mays. Janice Mays has been here also for 40 years. She beat me by 6 months, as you can see. And
I'll always be the older sibling.
And when you hear her, you'll see that not only is she younger, but she's getting much brighter every day. Then we have Jason Furman. Jason Furman, we're especially honored, used to be the chairman of the JEC, and now he's at Peterson.
CEA.
Yes, that's right, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, I think the 28th. And we're especially delighted because to get tax reform, true tax reform, we need it done bipartisan, and we're so pleased that he's here and also honored that he's joined our board of scholars. And then we have Chuck Lane. What to say? He started with the New Republic, then he went to the Washington Post, but he also appears on Fox News. It's real news and fake news, and you can figure out what it is today. So
Yes.
having said that, let me turn it over to Chuck, and then when Chairman Roskin comes in, he'll just join the conversation.
Thank you very much, Mark. Yes, and we do apologize that Mr. Roskin is apparently running a little bit late, but even without him, I feel safe in saying that if you were the kind of person who woke up early in the morning to talk about taxes, this is the group, this is the panel you would want to talk about taxes with. And since they don't need any further introduction, I'll jump right in. The program, pretty straightforward. I'm going to ask each one of our panelists a question, get their response to that. Then we're going to have a little bit of response to the responses among our group, and I'm sure that we'll have plenty of time after that to field questions from you guys in the audience, which is, of course, always the best part. So I was going to start with Alan Auerbach, and as I'm sure everybody in this room knows, the headline controversial proposal out there in the House, the border adjustment tax, I think it's, what is it called, the DBCFT. That's a simplified way of describing it. Destination-based cash flow tax for the corporate sector. Is often either credited or blamed to you, and in that connection, I thought I'd give you the chance to briefly make an argument for why it should be part of tax reform. But in the course of doing that, I'd like you to answer what I think a number of us think is the most, or one of the most salient criticisms, which is it depends for it to work smoothly without disruption to the economy. Depends on a strengthening of the dollar as an adjustment in the process. And there are a lot of skeptics, particularly in the financial community, people who consider themselves sort of real-world practitioners, who think that won't ever really come about. So I'd like to turn it over to you for just a couple of minutes to discuss that, and then we'll turn to Jason and Janice in turn.
Thanks very much. I think it just briefly, because people often lose sight of the fact that this proposal has a motivation other than just having effects. The corporate sector has changed enormously over the last several decades, Intellectual property is a much more important component of production. The multinational is a much more central part of the corporate sector. And these two things mean that our traditional ways of trying to tax business income, particularly corporate income, are just not very effective. And we currently have a system where we try to tax based on some combination of a company's residence and where a company is producing and supposedly earning its profits. And both of these approaches, and the U.S. is a hybrid system, lead to really serious distortions, much worse than they were, a century or more ago when we thought our tax system was a pretty good one. Residence-based taxation has led to corporate inversions, which we're really not very good at stopping and wouldn't necessarily want to completely. It led to the so-called lockout effect, where multinationals are keeping large amounts of corporate profits offshore to avoid further taxation and bringing them back to the U.S. Attempting to tax based on the location of production and profits, particularly with multinationals using intellectual property, has led to a vast amount, hundreds of billions of dollars a year in profit shifting to low-tax countries. And in addition, especially because of our high corporate tax rate, it's led companies to shift actual production offshore to avoid the higher U.S. tax. Other countries have responded to this by relying more on their VATs, relying less on corporate taxes. The U.S. was once in the middle of the pack, even toward the low end after the '86 Act. In terms of its tax rate, it's now the highest. And so we've got a broken corporate tax system, and nibbling around the edges is really just not going to do it. Now, of course, you could just have a big corporate tax cut, and some people think that's what we should do, but then you've got to figure out where you're going to get the revenue from to run the government. And so that really is the main motivation for moving to a destination-based cash flow tax. There are other arguments as well that I won't go into, but also matter. In terms of objections, it certainly has to be said, this is a major change. And with any major change, there are going to be short-run economic dislocations. That is true of any major tax reform. I think one needs to keep in mind that by having transition provisions and smoothing the process of transition to the new tax system, a lot of these issues can be dealt with. And keep in mind that even when we're talking about whether the exchange rate whether the dollar appreciates by exactly 25% against other currencies, or whether it appreciates by more, somewhat more, or somewhat less, there will still be adjustments elsewhere in the economy that will make it so that the new situation is established. It may take a couple of years. And so anybody who says, we wake up the next day and everything is smooth sailing isn't being unrealistic simply about this proposal, but about any proposal this major. So I think the criticism that people have about this kind of proposal may be about this specific proposal in the current discussion, but it's really about any proposal that undertakes such a major reform.
Alan, we've got Chairman Roscom here,
Okay.
And so why don't we welcome him, and thank you, especially since the hearing's starting at 10.
Well, I'm going to call an audible here. And Alan, I hope you'll excuse us. I mean, I think you've reached a
That's fine.
convenient parenthesis. And Chairman Roscom.
Are you going straight to me?
No, that's right. It's time to hear from Jason. As a matter of fact, I wanted to say a few things. No, Chairman Roscom, thanks for dropping in. And well, you're in the thick of this thing. So, if there is a thing, we're not talking about Russia.
Yeah, thank you.
What's going on? Tell us what the lay of the land is, prospects for something happening, where things stand after the one-pager that came out from the White House.
Okay.
The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Okay, sounds good. Let me give you the state of play. Have you spoken yet?
No.
All right, so she can clean up everything I said. So first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to to be here this morning and to spend time with you on this panel. Let me just give you just a couple of observations, I think. Some of them are self-evident, but it's a little bit of a prelude to a diagnosis about where we are. It is self-evident, I think, that we're at a national inflection point on our tax discussion. And the inflection is driven by a couple of factors. First of all, there's no defender of the status quo. Pretty interesting. There's nobody, there's not a single person who walks the face of the earth who is in favor of the current version of the Internal Revenue Code. There's people that like elements of it, obviously, but nobody likes the whole thing, which is a very interesting dynamic. The second thing is, nobody really likes the IRS for different reasons, whether it's targeting on the conservative side or civil asset forfeiture or competency issues. The reputation that they had in the past of being tough but fair, they don't have that reputation today. And in my way of thinking, they don't deserve that reputation. So then finally, there's something that we would all describe as base erosion. Other people, if you're not involved in tax policy all the time, you'd say you just have this gnawing feeling and this sort of understanding that nothing good is happening and that our tax base is eroding. That is, companies are leaving, IP is getting locked out, the lockout effect in terms of the international system and so forth. Okay, so that creates this inflection. Moving forward, there was a blueprint, obviously, that was published last summer, which nobody paid any attention to. And then all of a sudden, Donald Trump wins the election, and that morning, that night, at some point, people had aha moments. Oh my goodness, this is a live round. This could actually become a significant document. And then it got reviewed. So here's where we stand. The House has this proposal as the blueprint. It's being discussed and sort of publicly litigated, and that's a very good thing. We'll have this hearing today. We'll have a hearing next week on border adjustment, and we'll have these continuous hearings moving forward. The White House essentially recalibrated or reformatted a lot of the campaign themes that the Trump team ran on. The Senate is sort of slowly engaging. I'm still looking for signs of life over there, but I'm sure that they're cogitating and thinking about a number of these things. But moving forward, I'm of the view that 2017 is the year. This either happens in 2017, or I think you turn the corner into 2018, the dynamic shifts, the energy shifts, the momentum shifts, and then what we'll be doing in the future is basically having discussions about, oh, you know, when did this company leave? When did that company leave? Because I'll tell you, you know, coming from the Chicago area, when Aon left its headquarters to go to the UK, that's incredibly significant. We saw the stories when Burger King and its parent company left Florida to go to Canada. That's significant. Walgreens tried to do their jailbreak a couple of years ago. They were not successful based on a lot of politics, but if we don't get this right, they'll make a move at some point. So I think that now is a season. There's different fault lines in both political parties that have to be reconciled and navigated through. We can maybe talk a little bit further about that. But I'm a little counterintuitive. I'm more upbeat about the prospect of fundamental tax reform than other people are. And I'm really counterintuitive in that I think, you ready? I think it's easier than healthcare. I think it's easier than healthcare. Why is that? Healthcare has become orthodoxy. Tax policy is not orthodoxy, and there's no defender of the status quo. And if framed up the right way, it can be incredibly aspirational, and it can be incredibly transformational. So it's really worth doing this work. So one of the themes that you're going to hear today in the hearing is, why is it worth doing this? Why grind through this? Why ask people to vote for difficult, controversial things? And the answer is because there's something so terrific at the end. What does this type of growth rate mean? How does it translate down into real wage growth? How does it translate down into real job creation? And what's the manifestation of that? So I'm not here pumping sunshine. I'm not telling you I've got, Peter Roskim's 3 easy points for tax reform. But I do know that the status quo, let me close by saying this, the status quo is completely unacceptable. Our current tax code is an island that's dissolving underneath us. and we've got an opportunity to jump to another position if we operate now. If we wait and dither and wring our hands and squander the opportunity, then we'll get stuck and we'll never move. And that doesn't end well for us. So I'd say, let's move. Let's develop a consensus and let's move.
Well, thank you very much. And I think in continuing to call audibles, I'm going to turn to Jason now, because Jason, I think, has a slightly different take about, let's say, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow of tax reform, so to speak. And I know, Jason, you've been deeply involved in the previous administrations thinking about corporate reform, and you came to a different place than obviously the Republicans have. So I would just like to hear your response, particularly on the representative's point about what the sort of stakes are here, and whether this expenditure of political energy is, is appropriately fine-tuned, let's say.
Great, and thanks so much to have me. And I'm also really honored to be on the board of advisors for the ACCF, and we agree on a lot and disagree on some things too, and I appreciate the tolerance of that diversity of opinion and debate. In putting together this panel, maybe they tried to find someone who likes the status quo and failed, so I don't think we're going to be able to have a debate of for and against the status quo here. I very much agree with the congressman on that. I agree with Alan that changes in the way our economy functions and the increased importance of intangibles has made the way we tax business income, especially overseas business income, increasingly untenable. I would add to that the fact that everyone else in the world has lowered their corporate rates over time. That statutory rate differential has also brought the international system increasingly under strain. I think the main economic benefits we could get, though, are the ones that derive from that, which are on the business side. That's where businesses have a choice of where to locate, a choice of where to have their headquarters, a choice of where to report their profits, a choice of where to make their investments. And that's where I think some of the biggest gains to tax reform could be had. On the individual side, not only do I think you don't necessarily get big growth gains, and let me give you one example. Let's say you take away the state and local deduction and put that money into lower tax rates. Did you just increase the incentive to work? The answer is actually not. And just to give you another way of thinking about it, let's say we taxed everyone at, just to use round numbers, 40% rate on 90% of their income. And somebody came along and said, you know what, I'm going to broaden the tax base. I'm going to tax you now on 100% of your income, and I'm only going to tax you at a 36% rate. Well, it turns out both of those are the same. If you work an extra hour, you get to keep 74 cents of it, 64 cents of it, and you pay the other 36 in taxes. So some of this has the feature of rearranging, and there may be arguments for rearranging, there may be arguments against it, but I think the biggest problem in the individual side is I think our tax code is a big problem. I also think our deficit is a big problem. I think our shortchanging the investments we need to make in our future is a big problem, which you could translate into we should spend more as a government. And I think the distribution of income is a big problem. I think we agree on the first statement that I just made about our tax code being a big problem. I hope we agree on the second, on the deficit. I'll bet we have some disagreements on the third and the fourth. To get tax reform done, I don't expect that we'd be able to resolve those disagreements on the size of government, how to deal with the deficit, how to deal with income distribution. So let's set those aside, say we're going to do it revenue neutral, distribution neutral. That's what President Reagan did, both of those with Janus in the 80s. This time around in the House, to their credit, they've talked about revenue neutrality. The administration's talked about distribution neutrality, but seems to have wandered rather far away from that with their one page of principles. But let's bring that back, make that the premise, focus on the business system, and not try to use this as an opportunity to litigate the distribution of income or the size of government. And then I think we could get something done. That thing, by the way, I don't think it's necessarily gold, but I think it's like a pot of silver. It's an extra 2-3 tenths on our growth rate over the next decade. I would scrounge for every 10th we could get, as long as we didn't make some other problem worse. So I'm for that, but I wouldn't be under the illusion that it's so great it's worth sacrificing a lot to get to.
Thank you, Jason. I'm going to turn to Janice Mays now. And Janice, you've been inside the Ways and Means Committee probably longer than most people in Washington have even done live.
Yeah.
Now, and of course, now you're looking at it from the outside. Maybe I'd like to hear your take on the political prospects, and maybe a little bit of a response to Chairman Roscoe's assessment of whether or not 2017 is do or die in that sense. And along the way, maybe you'll reflect on the partisan, the difference between now and 1986 in terms of the prospects for anything becoming bipartisan out of this.
And I did not single-handedly do the 86 Act. I'm just among those still alive to talk about it. And I apologize, I have a summer cold. I think 2017 is a lovely year that began with some momentum. So it does give you a chance. The next year's an election year. It's always harder to do anything in an election year. So in that sense, I agree. There are some things that have happened, like 86. You've had people like Dave Camp put out a proposal. You've had debate for a number of years now. So people have begun to look at these issues. The blueprint does have some new ideas in it, and it takes a while for new ideas to really kind of catch on. Sometimes they have to sit in the pantry on the shelf for a while, but they're in the ether now, and they may or may not be the place that this could go. But I will say that the difficulty that I see is, and when tax reform is done again, it will have created its own path. It won't be the same path as the 86 Act. But among the things I think that are prerequisites to actually achieve tax reform, I go a little bit in the direction of Jason here, and that is you have to decide. I've sort of thought about it more as, is it revenue neutral under the new rules of what revenue neutral is, or is it really a net tax cut? In the context of that, you are deciding, is this going to be your battleground for the size of government, basically? Or is this going to be, and that resolution, I had hoped that the president's one-pager would address that. That was kind of the thing I was looking for most, because someone's got to set the tone for that. And right now you have this debate going on of, is this really a tax cut, or is this more tax reform that is neutral, and for all the things we give, we find someone else with that we take something from. And I find that has, I think, not been resolved going into this. And that's going to be important for the committees to figure that step out, to make the next steps kind of possible. And like you, I read too much news these days and listen to too much news these days. I've begun to treat it like a soap opera, where I check in a couple of times a week. And I get enough tweets and emails from everybody to know most of what's going on anyway. But I kind of check in once a week, because it's like, it's not the Twin Towers, but it's emotional like that for all of us watching whichever side. And I watch Fox News, I watch CNN, I watch them all.
But just once a week.
Just about once a week. It's enough. I have to turn it off. So anyway, you watch that, and it does seem to me our divide among the bases of both sides here, and I'll make it difficult. It is why the leaders, I think, of both houses would prefer to go in a bipartisan direction. But Mitch McConnell has watched the nomination process. He's watched all of these things that have been happening, and he's watched the base of both parties demand that they be divided. And he perceives that he can only get there through a partisan direction, through this reconciliation instruction direction. And that makes it very, very hard. When one party within itself has to kind of, and there are debates within that party, and you're not kind of reaching out more broadly, it's a difficult step. But is 2017 a good year to try to do this? I agree with Jason. The international pieces we've got to figure out how to do. And our conventional wisdom is that the politics won't allow us to go forward without a middle-class tax cut as part of this. So you've got very hard pieces. You have to thread a number of eyes of a number of needles. So we will see if very smart, very thoughtful people who want to accomplish this can find a way forward.
Thank you, Janice. And we have somebody on the panel, of course, and Chairman Roscom, who's an expert in threading that. But before we turn to the actual political practitioner, I want to go back to Alan Auerbach, who's in the field of rational economics and therefore maybe not equipped to deal with the problem Janice just posed, which is this entire political system is dominated by emotion. But I wanted to put to you the problem of what the point of this is, whether it's reduction in the overall tax burden or whether it's got to be deficit neutral and that whole thing. And again, bring it back to the blueprint and the controversy over the border adjustment tax. Is the purpose of this border adjustment tax to keep a corporate tax cut deficit neutral, or is the purpose of it to achieve the sort of relocation of productive activity in the United States?
When I was writing about this over the years, I never thought about the issue of the deficit. I thought about the issue of the structure of taxation. Moving to a destination-based tax means that the U.S. no longer is putting any tax penalty at all on production in the United States, on the location of profits in the United States. And I think that is the fundamental reason for adopting an approach like this. Now, as to the deficit, it is true that border adjustment raises a lot of revenue in the short run. Some people, I think, mistakenly say that in the long run it doesn't raise any revenue. I think that would be true if there were no profit shifting. There's an enormous amount of profit shifting, and so it raises revenue even in the long run, if not as much as in the short run. But that obviously has political benefits in terms of trying to come up with a package that is revenue neutral. So even if the original motivation for it is not, that is for border adjustments, is not to come up with a source of revenue to make the whole package revenue neutral, that certainly is one of the political benefits of it.
Serendipity is good.
Thank you, Alan. Chairman Roskin, back to you. I mean, the majority leader, I think just either yesterday or the day before on CNBC, or sorry, Bloomberg, sorry, Bloomberg, repeated his insistence that it all be deficit neutral. Of course, the president's plan wasn't really a plan, but didn't appear to be deficit neutral. How vital is it to you guys that it, well, what's your position on that? Is it going to have to be deficit neutral, or is that a deal breaker or something?
I described a fault line, and so this is an emerging fault line. And it has to be, this to Janice's point, this has to be decided as a threshold issue. It's foundational. So go back. So in my view, it is very important that it's revenue neutral, and it's revenue neutral not just on the notion of deficit pressure and taking on debt and so forth, but there's a real feature here, and the feature is permanence. Think about it. We've got temporary tax policy in this country and permanent spending policy. I would argue that we'd be better off if those were inverted. In other words, we had permanent tax policy and temporary spending policy that were reevaluated periodically. That's the way my constituency in suburban Chicago would prefer to have things. And if we want permanent tax policy, that means it's got to be revenue neutral. So here's the other thing. There's these comparisons that I've heard from friends of mine that have said, hey, look, just cut the stinking taxes. You know, just cut the taxes, and it'll all be great. Don't worry about it. And they make a comparison to the 01 and the 03 tax cuts. They further make a comparison, and they say, well, look, you extend those out, 97% of those were made permanent, so what's the big deal? Cut them now, have a 10-year window, and just deal with it at the end of the 10-year window. But what we're doing, the reason that is not the preferable route is because what we're proposing is to change business behavior. We're making an argument. We want to make the United States the most attractive tax jurisdiction in the world. We want to have a transformational moment as it relates to tax reform. What tax planner, what CEO, who in a C-suite or in a boardroom is going to say, yeah, let's seriously talk about reshoring that manufacturing operation but with the knowledge that the tax code is going to be expiring in 10 years. Or as my legislative director, Joe Faywell, has said, the entire tax code turns into a big extender. That's not particularly helpful. So I think it's important to be thinking about this, the benefit of revenue neutral. And, you know, to Jason's point, set aside the deficit question for a minute. And while those are significant questions, the real feature here, is permanence. And permanence is absolutely worth pursuing. So I was encouraged by the fact that Leader McConnell said that this was going to be very, very important. And I would echo that.
Yeah, you go ahead, Jason.
Oh, yeah. I think there was not a single word there I remotely disagreed with.
Okay,
I thought
he
that was
yields
terrific.
back.
I thought that was terrific. I do want to point out one word that I actually preferred in your answer than that I preferred in Charles's question, which is deficit neutral versus revenue neutral. And those are subtly different because one of them says you can make spending cuts to pay for it, and the other
Yes,
says you're doing it all.
By the way,
within
I
the
should have
tax
said
code.
revenue neutral, that's what I meant.
And I think that revenue neutrality, doing this within the four corners of the tax code, is a really important way to cabinet. And while we're saying positive things, you had asked before, you know, Chairman Camp came forward with a plan. It's actually very similar to the plan that we had come forward with, the framework we had come forward with in the Obama administration. I think those would have been a big improvement over the tax code we have now. I think there's elements in the House blueprint that would be an even bigger improvement than what we had proposed, and in particular, shifting to expensing and ending the deductibility of interest, which has gotten a lot less discussion than destination basis border adjustment is an issue that ACCF, I suspect, has been in favor of for a long time. I think merits further discussion and likely would be an even bigger improvement than the paradigm for tax reform that we had put forward and that Chairman Camp had put forward.
Janice, are there little, I almost want to call them cute little things that could be done in this process? You know, because once you throw the whole thing up for grabs, lots of cute little things start running around and maybe can get through that wouldn't have otherwise. And one of my favorites is, you know, fixing up the EITC, making it broader in its coverage and perhaps a little more generous, as well as dealing with the problem of the improper payments that has been a chronic problem with that. Let's just, you know, given that distribution is, as Jason pointed out, economic income distribution a hot topic, and is going to, if it's going to be bipartisan, all is going to have to be addressed. Is that an area where you think there could be?
That is an area. It's not an area that by itself gets you to full bipartisanship, but it is an area that I think lots of us on both sides have thought we could come to common ground on. The Speaker of the House has expressed interest in looking in this area, and there are a number of cleanups there. There are a number of expansions and shrinkages and things that, along with families with children, there are a series of things in those refundable credits that I think could be done very straightforwardly and make things better. It is unfortunate that it is an area that then gets caught up in immigration policy. And so it's often hard to just kind of face that kind of straight on and deal with it. And when it gets mired in the potential who you don't want to benefit from it among the immigrant groups in the country, then it goes back to being a partisan thing. And so every issue that may even be cute becomes a difficult issue to straddle differences, especially when both parties at the moment are being kind of forced to be antagonistic toward each other, and building those relationships. The Ways and Means Committee has spent a long time trying to build relationships internally, but that is not true across the Congress at large. And so you get caught up in these kind of side issues. The middle class tax cut part of this is a piece that I think could lead you to bipartisanship. The question there, then the stumbling blocks becomes what happens at the top 1% and 1/10 of 1%, kind of what's going on in that context. But that's one thing. People, I think, have often thought you could look at some of the maybe through the tax code, some of the transportation and infrastructure pieces and do those. So there are pieces one can reach out to. You have to, though, to get, I think, to a broad bipartisan proposal, you have to sit down with people and say, let's develop a plan together. You can't come and say, here is my plan, what can I do for you in addition to this? And it's hard to get there. Just that the world makes that a difficult thing to do right now, because you kind of have to have your own plan. And I think you don't get to really face that issue unless there's difficulty in dealing with the fiscal 18 budget resolution. Then that potentially opens you up to kind of broader bipartisanship to try to achieve your goals right now. And people sort of look to the Senate being the place that might get to start that, because the House kind of has its plan and it's trying to move forward with it. But I cheer on bipartisanship, let me say. I think you have a better chance for permanence. I think that was a lesson in the health reform debate, that people just aren't angry because they didn't do it to some extent. You have to kind of face that. But yeah, there are pieces when there are lots of things everybody kind of agrees we need to fix. The education proposals, all of the different tax incentives for education. We'd all love to clean that up and make that simpler. But a lot of that is held back because people would rather see the broad reforms. And it will be a shame not to get some of those broader reforms. I'm not certain that I think the same things that drove the 86 Act are there today. So I don't know if just, I'm sort of with Jason here again, I don't know that just base broadening and lower rates is kind of the thing that really sort of drives this. But there are lots of, we have a hodgepodge of a tax code that doesn't work well internationally, and the business community is frustrated with. They're also frustrated with the regulations that go along with that, so it's kind of a common thing. It'd be nice to figure out a way to address it. I think we've advertised tax reform as too much, as potentially
He hasn't,
more
but
than
some
you
people
could
have,
do.
yes.
I keep not quite answering your question.
No, I think you
That's
answered
what
it
is.
extremely well. Did anybody want to make a comment in response to that? Well, in that
I mean,
case,
the one thing I'd say, sorry, is, I mean, I think we're having this very civilized discussion here, which is wonderful. The administration is in, as far as I can tell, a completely different universe. The one page they put forward was not a move towards bipartisanship relative to what the House Republicans put forward, but was well to the right of it, with lower rates, all the things that have been argued would help growth, the expensing and interest deduction, the destination basis border adjustment, were absent from that one-page blueprint. And the 15% rate for pass-throughs is just about the most ludicrous tax idea I've seen put forward in terms of just how vastly costly it would be, with very little economic rationale for it. And if you want to clean up the tax code, the way to do it is not to create lots of different rates based on how you label yourself, and you can recharacterize through all of those. So I am very, very worried about where the actual state of our debate is when the White House is talking about a big, big tax cut, which didn't sound to me like a code word for revenue neutrality. The last thing I'd say is, dynamic scoring. I guess I'm not going to have my ACCF thing revoked because I'm for it. I think it's a good idea, and I think it's a good idea provided it's done by the professionals that we trust to do all our scoring, the people at JCT and CBO. If they tell me a tax cut helps growth, I'll probably believe that. If they tell me the deficits associated with an unpaid for tax cut end up actually hurting growth in the long run, I would find that plausible too, and I think there's a decent chance that'd be the case. There's certainly no one though that thinks that dynamic scoring is going to take you from 5.5 trillion down to zero. Even the Tax Foundation, which I love dearly but would not have in charge of our official scorekeeping, wouldn't say that.
thanks, Jason, and Chairman Roskin. I again want to put you on the spot a little bit because he does raise the sort of loud bang of that 15% pass-through and all the other things that were in the one-pager. I mean, what is the conversation like right now between the Hill and the White House? We'd love it if you would tell us violate all kinds of confidences. In fact, the camera will zoom in even closer
between us.
as you do. But really, I mean, what are you doing between the Hill and the White House right now, if anything, to resolve these kinds of points?
So let me sort of take a running start at a straight answer. So we've got this proposal in the blueprint that has now gotten obviously more attention, and it's tangible, you know what I mean? It's a substantive proposal, and as the committee is going through it, going in more detail, you know, in terms of narrowing down on energy policy and on education policy and treatment of pass-throughs and retirement policy and all these things that you would imagine are pretty intuitive, we're trying to develop a consensus as a committee. There are discussions, and I would just characterize them that way, as discussions with the White House and with Senate Finance and Senate leadership on all of these top-line themes. Some of them have been reported publicly, some of them have not been reported publicly, but these are general discussions. And so what the objective is to introduce one bill. So the name of the game here is not to have a House bill, White House language, and Senate finance language. That is not the optimal thing. So the optimal thing is to introduce one bill, develop the consensus around that. And so, you know, you can argue both ways in terms of what the White House put out. On the one hand, you know, we can say, wow, it was a recharacterization of campaign themes. On the other hand, you can say, well, it's helpful that they didn't put out 100 pages of detail publicly. So I choose to live the happy life of low expectations. And my happy life of low expectations suggests to me that it's a better thing not to have 100 pages that the White House is wedded to in public, in detail, that then has to be sort of re-navigated, and that we're probably going to get to a better place if we can have those discussions. But the nature of the challenge is not lost on me. I mean, it's obvious. The language surrounding tax reform versus tax cuts and sort of the subtext of all that those phrases carry with it are incredibly significant, which is why I described this earlier as a fault line. This is a fault line within my party. It's a fault line within the conservative movement. There is not unanimity about the disposition towards these things. I keep coming back at this and describing this in terms of permanence. Permanence is a virtue as it relates to tax policy. Permanence is worth pursuing. Permanence is a foundation upon which you can build a strong economy. And I think that way to frame it up is far more compelling than sort of, you know, with all due respect, you know, kind of green eye shade approaches, which seem pretty esoteric and so forth. I think let's talk about permanence and what we do to get to a permanent tax code. And look, Janice made a great point. You also get on a trajectory toward permanence if you're able to do it on a bipartisan basis, and that's a significant foundation upon which you can build permanence.
I want to get to the audience question in a moment, but I had one last one for Alan Auerbach, and it does come off of this quip about the green eye shade nature of this debate. In the border adjustment tax is a very wonky thing. Even those who like it, I would imagine, consider it a very wonky thing, although you're an expert on that. And furthermore, it's on the corporate side, and the polls will show that the one thing the public thinks about corporate taxes is they ought to pay more. So give us a sense of how this program, this tax, if it were brought in, would benefit the average wage earner, and what's in it for him or her?
Well, I mean, the objective is to encourage companies to produce and report profits in the United States. And you can talk about it in terms of the what it will do for wages, what it will do for employment. Somebody could easily label this, yet another trickle-down argument. But I think, as Jason has said, that the business tax reform is really where the action is in terms of increasing productivity growth in the United States. It's true that it's not a simple argument to make, to go to citizens and say, look, those multinational companies that haven't been paying taxes, we're not simply going to stick it to them. We're going to restructure the tax system in a way that encourages them to hire more people, locate more production facilities, pay taxes in the United States instead of shifting their profits to other countries. It is inherently esoteric, but I think the message can be put in language that matters to people, because ultimately a lot of what the election was about, a lot of what unhappiness among the populace is about, is relatively stagnant wage growth, and which in turn relates to our low recent levels of productivity growth. So ultimately, that's what we need to be seeking to do to address those problems. It's, of course, it's hard to turn that into a populist message, but this approach is not inherently a partisan approach. I think it's something on which there ought to be a lot of agreement. There hasn't been so far because of the nature of partisanship in Washington, but it's not inherently a partisan approach.
Well, yeah, in fact, if I'm not wrong, your first paper on this was done with CAP, with Center for American Progress, right? Or one of your first?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Okay, Art, I'm going to turn it over. It's about 10 minutes to 9. We got plenty of time. Please, if you have a question, raise your hand, briefly identify yourself, and do keep it to a question, not a attack on Alan Auerbach on behalf of Walmart or something like that. Who would like to go first? All these bright-eyed, bushy-tailed people early in the morning, and no questions yet? Okay, Pinar, you can start.
Since I put the panel together, I might as well start. Thank you so much. It's like shameless self-advertisement. I put a great panel together.
Well done.
Let's
Yes,
say,
you did, didn't you?
Let's say border tax adjustment became politically too toxic. Are we looking at alternatives to make tax reform happen? Because I get this question a lot. If you don't like border tax adjustment, what is your alternative? We need to, yes, restructure the business incentives to bring business back here, and we need revenue too. Congressman Roscoe, Chairman Roscoe, do you think we have alternatives? Are we looking for it?
It's hard to give you a straight answer on that, and here's why. In the House, we perceive that we're building a car that will actually run, and that is a comprehensive approach, and that you could actually, assume for the sake of argument that we get all the details. There's an interactive nature to what the blueprint is. Other themes are out there. They're more, broad statements and so forth, but there's not a comprehensive nature to them. So our proposal on border adjustment is driven by a couple of things. One, you alluded to, and that's revenue. But the other thing is to get this base erosion question right. I mean, if you would distill down the foundation upon which the blueprint is built, there's 4 key goals. They're pretty intuitive. You'll agree with all of them. And we can either dial them up or dial them back. But we propose to have real growth, simplicity, which we haven't talked about too much today. But there's a real desire on the behalf of my constituents just to have a simpler tax code. This base erosion problem, which border adjustment completely eclipses. It just doesn't. You're not incentivized to put things offshore. And then finally, and I keep coming back to this, permanence. So are we bidding against ourselves? No. Am I going to be here on a panel, in front of God and everybody and say, well, if border adjustment doesn't work, we can go here, here, and here? No, I don't think that's helpful. So we've built border adjustment into the very foundation of our structure. And our view is, well, let's make a decision about those 4 themes that I mentioned a minute ago. And if we choose to walk away from one of them or whatever, then if we say base erosion's too hard to deal with, okay, then that's another question. If we say we're going to throw in the towel on permanence, okay, I guess. I mean, these are not optimal things, but there's not there's not a plan B, if that's what you're asking for, in terms of an initial proposal coming out of the House.
One of the original problems with border adjustment, one of the political problems, I think, has been that it has been debated in a vacuum, not debated in the context of here are your other options.
Right.
And a number of the companies and groups that have come out in favor of it have looked at those other anti-base erosion options, at least in the international tax context, and said, we like those less than we like this. But for most people, it's been just, this has been because you don't have a bill, people need to look back at some of Dave Kemp's options and other things to see some of those anti-base erosion options. But being debated in a vacuum, it's the same thing with the interest deduction. You kind of don't know what your other options are to compare it to have kind of a real tough debate. And I think that's one of the reasons you guys are trying so hard to at least get it through the House. Then if the Senate, if you can't start with the same bill, they have some of that debate, and then you're able to have that comparison.
I agree completely.
Yeah. I mean, I would make 3 points. One, from an economic perspective, I actually don't think it's integral to the approach. You look at Alan Viard and Bob Carroll put together a thoughtful proposal for shifting to a consumption tax that had many of the features of the Better Way plan, including expensing and ending interest deduction. They devoted a lot of thought to the question of whether they would do border adjustment with destination basis or whether they would do something else. They chose not to because of what they argued was be the large loss of value to Americans of our foreign asset holdings and vice versa, transfer to foreigners. David Bradford had a proposal along these lines. He also chose not to do destination basis border adjustment. So economically, I can see the arguments for it. I can see the arguments against it, most of which are a set of severe transition costs that make me very nervous. But I actually don't think we absolutely need it, would be my first point. The second point is I agree with Janice. This is all about, what your alternative is. The current system for taxing international income is abysmal. It's probably the worst part of our tax code, collecting no revenue while imposing distortions. I think there's a lot of different ways to improve on it. I think a minimum tax would be a little bit more of a small c conservative way to improve on it. It would be less of a radical change from our system today. It would have the territorial feature that you can repatriate your income freely, but it wouldn't give away your tax base. If you set the minimum tax rate at 15%, for example, companies doing business in countries with real tax codes would not pay us any taxes at all. They'd have a tax credit against it. They'd basically have territorial treatment. Companies that claimed that they were making all their money in the Cayman Islands would be paying us the 15%, and that's a good thing. So that'd be my second point, is minimum tax. My third is minimum tax doesn't raise as much money as border adjustment. I think the 20% rate, let alone the 15% rate, is really unrealistic. I spent countless years with the team at Treasury looking at dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of corporate tax plans. We wanted to get the rate as low as possible. We weren't ideological about it. We had a really hard time pushing it below 28%. Without border adjustment, I think that's going to be really hard to do. I believe the BRT's asked for 25. I don't quite even see how you get there. If you do and it's revenue neutral, that's great. I'm for it. But I really just don't think the arithmetic is going to work on 20. But you've seen a lot of scores too. So.
Any other questions? If you move your hand, you're asking a question. You, sir. I thought you.
Oh.
Moved your hand.
I guess I missed the first couple of minutes. When, as far as like timing, you think like next year, the end of this
Want to be
year?
the great Karnak.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, we did have Janice, Chairman Roscom declare that 2017 is the optimum year, for reasons that he could repeat if he wants. But I maybe I'll follow up on your question myself and say, well, what about within 2017? What's the I
Wild
think that's-
horses is not going to get a number out of me.
Yeah.
So think of this in terms of ripening fruit. So when fruit is ripe, you know it's ripe. This is not like pull the fries out in 7 seconds, man. You know what I'm saying? So
And if you can truly get one bill between House, Senate, and administration, then you can go relatively quickly. If you're starting with something that's very different in the House from whatever the Senate is then going to move, and the Senate waits for you to move, you have this more kind of, somebody's got to have moved first and more quickly, I think. So that gives you a chance to go later in the year before you really start the kind of super legislative process. You've also, if you're going to proceed on a budget reconciliation direction here, you have to do a fiscal year 2018 budget resolution, or steal back the health one and admit that that may not become law, and both of those two things are hard. So you've got some threshold pieces to get through before the committees really have to put out a product as such, I think.
Mark?
I just want to get everybody before they leave. I really want to thank you, Chairman Roskin, and this panel.
there is one thing I do want to mention, is that I have a tax plan here that Janice Mays doesn't know she wrote. So if anybody wants a tax plan, you trust me, don't you, 40 years, Janice?
I do, but I believe we differ on a couple of basic things. So you're making me nervous, yes.
But anyway.
I've never been invited to be on the board.
I don't know how you do, but anyway, everybody loves Janice Mays. This is Janice Mays tax plan, so when you go to the committee, you can just.
Fantastic.
You do a unanimous consent. and
Be
That's right.
careful,
bring
be
along-
careful, because capital gains and earned income may be taxed the same. So be careful.
I know, I
Be careful.
Well, if there are no further questions, I'm going to give each member of the panel to make a brief closing remark, and then we'll, if they wish to, any unvoiced thought left over from the panel. Alan, did you have something?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on a point that Jason made that relates to what the congressman said about permanence. Countries around the world have been cutting their corporate taxes. There's an ongoing process of very strong tax competition. And trying to deal with the current problems of the current tax environment using measures like minimum taxes and other adjustments, I would say, around the edges is like trying to hit a moving target. And if you adopt a system like that, that may lessen the pressures we currently face, but it will not work in the long run because other countries are going to continue to react. So you need to have a stronger response. Now, whether that response happens now or whether it happens in the future after first adopting more minor changes is a question that we will have an answer to. But I don't think you should kid yourself that the kind of response you talked about is any kind of long-run response. It will certainly, I agree with you, it's better than the current system. It will improve things in the short run. But if we go that way, we're going to have to revisit the business tax system in the not-too-distant future, given the evolution of tax systems around the world.
Janice?
I've said too much already.
All right. I'm sure Chairman Roscoe, you don't feel
No,
you said
tune
too
in
much, right?
in 1 hour and watch the Ways and Means hearing. You're going to love it. You'll love the show.
I would just say tune in 1 hour to the Ed and Labor Subcommittee on Help hearing that I'm testifying at on the fiduciary role.
Touche. Well done.
And I would simply say, none of you guys are going to be watching those hearings because Jim Comey is testifying.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
That was a joke, not a Washington Post scoop. I really meant what I said at the beginning, which is that if you wanted to discuss taxes, I don't care whether it was early in the morning, in the middle of the night, or over lunch, this would be the group you would want to talk about it with. And I want to thank you all very much and thank ACCF for putting it together. Class dismissed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Charles. Hey, do you have a card?
You know,